So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at graphing supply based off what we just learned about the changes in quantity supplied and changes in supply. So to review, remember supply is a behavior of producers. They produce goods based on their willingness and ability to do so. So price and quantity supplied have a converse relationship as opposed to the inverse relationship price and quantity demanded have. So on the law of supply, stating that other things remain equal, the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises. So remember, of course, then the opposite is true. When prices fall, quantity supplied will fall. Incentive is a primary motivator of production because when prices rise, we have the incentive to produce more goods because of the fact that we have a greater opportunity for total revenue. So as prices increase, the quantity supplied increases, and then of course vice versa. Higher prices equal higher revenues, thus increases in production. So these are the main points to remember from a review perspective. So let's look at our supply schedule. So the supply schedule shows the quantities produced at different price levels. And this shows us that the incentive to increase production is the opportunity to generate greater revenues. So when we look at our supply schedule here, we'll notice that as ice cream cones, as the price goes down, notice the quantity of supplied cones goes down as well. In fact, at 50 cents, we won't even produce it all. And of course, as price rises, the quantity of cones rises as well. Okay, so let's take the time here to look at how we would graph this. So here we have our supply schedule. And so we look at our points. And as we move up, we'll notice our points generating here. And then our line, so there's our supply curve. And what it tells us, of course, is an increase in price is an increase in the quantity of cones supplied. That seems to be pretty standard, pretty simple to get. Remembering, of course, that quantity supplied moves in a converse relationship, whereas quantity demanded moves in that inverse relationship. Also, like demand, you'll notice that supply has individual and market supply. So as with demand, supply is not endless. Let's look at why. So supply is not endless because if prices fall below a certain point, producers will leave the market. Like you just saw a second ago, at 50 cents, nobody was willing to produce, so therefore that was the end of that. However, the price at which producers will leave the market is different for each producer. Much like consumers, everyone has a different idea of how much they're willing to pay. Producers have a schedule here based upon how much they're willing to pay, and each of them are not willing to risk profits by continuing to produce even into a negative. So at some point they of course will stop. As a result, different producers have different supply curves. And then once you add them all together, what you end up of course with is market supply. Okay, this is the graphing the individual and market supply. So our two top graphs here are individual, whereas our bottom is the market. So as we look at this product here for Coke and we graph out what we see for Coke, then what we notice is here is Coke's supply line. Now notice, of course, when we come over here to the next one, we have Pepsi. Pepsi's supply line is a little different. It's a little steeper. So what happens when you put those together to generate your market supply? Well, so down at the bottom, we have our market supply with our points. Our market supply is $1 and 2. And then we have 3 and 4.5. And then we have 5 and 6. So this is our market supply. So remember now, the way the market supply works is it's an amalgamation of all individual supply curves. So much so that if 1 or 2 people actually leave the market, it doesn't really change the supply curve because there's already so many people producing. So let's see what occurs when we have changes in quantity supplied. Remember, of course, that when prices change, they change the quantity supplied. So this is the basis of our law of supply. So changes in price cause movements along the supply curve. So let's look at that. So here we have a graph. We'll plot our points out. And so here's our supply curve. So if we have point A and we have point B, and we want to create and see what happens when we have an increase from A to B. So what we have is when A increases, so price increases from point A to point B. And then what happens, of course, is the quantity supplied will increase from point A to point B. So increases in price cause increases in quantity supplied. Now at the same time though, if we start at point A and we decrease down to point C, so now we're decreasing price, what we see with a decrease in price from A to C is we see that with our price dropping, our quantity supplied will drop as well. So that tells us, of course, that we have this converse relationship between supply and quantity well, with quantity supplied and price. Now, when we look at changes in supply, though, it's different. Remember, for the determinants of supply, price of related goods, input price, technology, expectations, and size of the market, each of these has the ability to change supply without changing the price. So first, let's look at an increase in supply. So we'll put our chart up here with our graph, and we have our line. So originally, we call this just SO, for supply zero. It's our original supply curve. So what were to happen, of course, if we see an increase in supply? Well, for example, what if the input prices decrease? If that happens, then we can produce more of a good without charging more for it. So SO now would become S1. It shows us that we see a shift to the right in supply when input prices fall. So you'll notice here, of course, the price never changed. It was 4, but it did go from being 4.5 up to 6.5. So we saw an increase in quantities in the supply curve because it shifted. Now, if we see a decrease in supply, so it shifts to the left. So now we'll notice we have SO and we go to S2. Price still doesn't change. But what we notice, of course, is now you can actually supply less. So if we had an increase in the input prices, we would be able to keep the price the same, but we'd have to supply less of a good. And that's how this supply curve works and this demand curve. They're based on these prices and also the determinants of the two groups.